Thank you all for coming out on a Saturday as well. It shows that you're very passionate and you really care. And that means a lot to the team and I. We've worked so resiliently over the past over a year to get this event together for you. So we're quite excited. All right, without further ado, I'm going to get started. My name is Jacqueline Plattis. I am the chair and founder of the Conference on Law and Ethical Responsibility of Business, informally known as the CLERB. I created this event over a year ago because I wanted to have this conversation. I wanted to have a conversation with engineers, with lawyers, with social scientists, students, young professionals, people like me that are just trying to find their way. And it's become something much bigger than I ever thought it would be, but it's an incredible forum for all of us to connect. And we've gotten the most incredible speakers for you guys from a variety of different backgrounds that are really going to provide a well-rounded lens for you to understand where business is currently at, what they are doing, and how we predict they're going to be functioning in the future. We're just waiting now for Ruth Knox to log on. And once she's on here, we will be hearing from her. She is going to be talking about the strain of government regulations and regulation in 2020 for sustainability. Her expertise is very diverse, but she mainly works in environmental corporate law. And one of my favorite things about Ruth is that she's so accomplished at such a young age. She's very inspiring and she's very incredible. If you aren't familiar with Linklaters, it is one of the top international corporate law firms. So she's achieved an immense feat for herself at a young age. And I believe she's also based in the UK. So for all of those in the UK, she'll be a wonderful touch point if you have any questions about a career in law. Or questions about legislation moving forward, holding businesses accountable, and the roles that governments can play, pros and cons. Again, I'm just going to go over this quickly for you all. There will be question periods at the end of each speaker portion, so you can hop on via the question and answer box at the bottom. Or if you're comfortable, you can put your hand up and we will verbally allow you to ask questions. Here we are with Ruth. Welcome, Ruth.
Hi.
How are you doing this afternoon?
Very good, thank you. How are you, Jacqueline?
I'm doing well. I was just talking a little bit about you and who you are, your career, before I read out your formal bio as an introduction.
Super.
So guys, I'm going to formally introduce our first keynote speaker, who all of us are extremely grateful to have with us today, Ruth Knox. Her practice encompasses the allocation and management of environment, health, and safety, and product-related risks and liabilities in large-scale M&A transactions. Notable transactions where she has taken a lead of advisory role include the £6.825 billion sale of Unilever global spreads businesses and the sale of 4 distribution networks as part of a hive-down and share sale by National Grid. She is also one of the firm's experts on a number of product and energy regulatory areas, including the construction products regulations and the EU REACH regulation, the EU Energy Efficiency Directive, and UK mandatory carbon reporting. She is also a member of the Linklaters automotive sector team, and she has led the development of the firm's practice in respect of electric and autonomous vehicles. She's incredible, and without further ado, here is Ruth Knox.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. So I'm going to share some slides to help guide this presentation. So hopefully you can see those now. Can I just confirm that you can see them?
Yep, they're coming through perfectly.
Awesome. Okay. So if I start perhaps by giving an overview of myself and my background, a bit beyond the really helpful introduction that Jacqueline gave. So I've been at Linklaters, which is an international commercial law firm, for the past 10 years. I joined straight after my law degrees. I did law with French law at the LSE, and studied the LLM business law at University College London. And I chose Linklaters because they had a very strong emphasis across all practice areas, but in particular, a very notable strength in environmental law, which was the practice area that I was most interested in whenever I joined. And obviously, because Linklaters is a commercial law firm, when you join the firm, you get exposure to all of the traditional areas of corporate and finance practice. For me, it was no different. I started off in capital markets, moved round through the banking practice to environment and climate change, and then I finished off again in capital markets in Milan. And it was a really fantastic training experience. I actually qualified into the derivatives team at Linklaters, and I worked on a variety of structured finance transactions as part of that team before very quickly moving to the environment and climate change team as an associate in April 2013. And I have not looked back. It has been a fantastic journey. I've learned a great deal. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about what we are seeing in our practice around ESG, environment, social, and governance factors. Now, I've included the title here, the European Revolution. I think many of you will probably be thinking, isn't this a global issue? And you would be quite right. It is very much a global challenge. But when you look at it from the regulatory perspective, the impetus behind a lot of the changes that we're seeing in the ESG sphere are coming out of the European Union and a number of the member states in the EU. So perhaps with that, if I move on to the next slide, what exactly is ESG, environment, social, and governance factors? So we've included some examples on this slide. Starting with environment, you would be quite right in thinking that climate change is a huge factor forming part of the environmental element. But going back in time, whenever I started the practice, climate change wasn't really as much of a focus. And it was emissions management, resource management, and I think contaminated land and pollution were very much the issues of the day in terms of focus on transactions. We're obviously now seeing the development of new clean technologies, which is a huge opportunity for the commercial sphere and something that I think is very much worth keeping an eye on. Moving round the dial to social, in the past, health and safety would be one of those really core social elements which would feature in the S. But in recent years, we've seen a number of major regulatory projects focusing on the regulation of social issues such as modern slavery and human trafficking, labour management and labour relations, the management of suppliers, good practice on supply chain management, and also product safety and product integrity, the impact of one's products on the outside world. Governance, this will be familiar to many of you. It's a very, very broad concept, but nonetheless has been in focus for regulatory developments, I think a bit longer than the social. Anti-bribery and corruption regulation has been, I think, coming to the fore. Sanctions is another bucket which often sits here. But in recent years, this has evolved to topics such as board diversity, executive pay, the ratio between executive and employee pay, the integrity or the ethics of the business, and also tax transparency. So again, definitely an area to watch. Now, you can't really miss it when you read the press. I'm sure many of you are far too busy to read the newspapers every single day. As part of my job, I have to, and I frequently turn to the Financial Times. And the headlines are really coming thick and fast for us, showing the importance of good ESG management and the negative impacts of bad ESG management. Some of the examples are shown on this slide, and you can see at the top, digital human rights are the next frontier. For fund groups, investors take a critical look at potentially damaging role of some technology in everyday lives. That's the lesser spotted privacy in social, which has factored its way into. We've got child labor claims. We've got financial action on climate change from the major financial institutions, the impact of negative reputational risk, where pension funds perhaps are not taking the issue as seriously as they might need to. We've got the CEOs of nearly 200 companies saying that shareholder value is no longer their main objective. We've seen a positive development in this respect, the evolution of the focus of CEOs towards the broader ESG agenda. And then you can see, obviously, some other headlines on the impact of climate risk. So what is driving the rise of this megatrend, the ESG megatrend as we call it? So you can see from this slide that there's a raft of national and supranational initiatives, which are part of a wholesale shift to embed ESG into the heart of business strategy. And I mean, you can see on the right-hand side that this is not just regulatory. You have shareholder and investor action at the bottom, and that's coupled with worker and public pressure. Obviously, the rise of the climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion, are generating a lot of attention to this agenda. And then we've also got you know, the traditional hard law regulatory developments, which are really coming thick and fast and keeping me extremely busy, I can tell you. Soft law, I would say here, the really interesting development in soft law is around the S, the social, where human rights principles have become embedded in soft law. We've seen the development of some really detailed, non-binding guidance around how corporates and businesses can properly integrate human rights due diligence into their processes. But overall, at the top of our rather strange tree, you can see that there is no single driver behind this megatrend. So what does this mean for business? Obviously, I work for a commercial law firm, and this is the focus that that I have day in, day out. I mean, I just think it's so interesting to see how many new challenges business will face in the years to come. And I would say in the next 10 years in particular, as this shift really accelerates the transition to a low carbon economy. We're seeing increased levels of board engagement when previously ESG was viewed as a fluffy matter for corporate sustainability reports and not something that would necessarily have to drive corporate strategy. We're seeing a fresh approach being taken to ESG risks. And that is evidencing itself in the changing of the alignment of incentives on remuneration of key decision makers. We're also seeing the rise of a new approach to disclosure, much of which I would say is driven by these regulatory changes, which I will come on to in a moment. The regulatory changes are also presenting a real challenge for corporates in terms of their easy access to finance, which is a really interesting area, which again, we'll touch on. You may also be very familiar with the rise of climate litigation. Causes of action are, I would say, increasing in this space as claimants and litigation funders are seeking new ways of holding decision makers to account in relation to the management or mismanagement of ESG risks. We're also seeing the rise of the rating agencies as they claim that they can give you a proper view on the ESG risk profile of businesses around the world, a new approach to stakeholder engagement with shareholders and investors as they begin to prioritize these risks in the management of their own agendas. We're seeing an increased focus on purpose, culture and values, which is really quite new and refreshing. And we're seeing businesses set themselves new goals on this ESG journey. So I've included a slide here which references a couple of guides that the firm produced on corporate sustainability with the University of Berkeley and a number of our clients, many of which are quoted on this slide. If we look at BlackRock, which is, as I'm sure many of you know, a highly active investor in the climate change space, the head of investment at BlackRock told that BlackRock's clients are increasingly familiar with ESG and its potential impact on long-term value, and they are more interested than ever in factoring ESG considerations into their investment mandates. We also see from Novartis that investors are increasingly focused not just on the financial performance of the company, but on making sure that organizations perform in a sustainable way. So what is the impact of the rise of mandatory legal requirements? So first of all, international agreements and state commitments seek enhanced action at the corporate level to meet targets which these international agreements and state commitments devote themselves to. This leads to enhanced NGO and social pressure or state intervention by regulation, which in turn takes the form of enhanced pressure on financial institutions to ensure that these goals are met. This drives new systems, policies, and procedures within the financial institutions in relation to how they manage their lending or their funding of corporates. And you can see that these new systems and policies and procedures on access to finance mean that greener corporates have access to cheaper finance and non-adopters have less favourable access to finance. This obviously means that corporates will begin to take the issue much more seriously, leading to increased and enhanced corporate disclosure and strategies, which it is hoped in turn will enable the achievement of the net zero agenda as enshrined in the international agreements. So this is the Jackson-Pollock slide, as we call it. It is the smorgasbord of ESG regulatory developments that we have seen emerge in the past, I would say, 8 years in particular. And at the very center, we have included a reference to the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a voluntary disclosure standard, fast mainstreaming in the financial and corporate spheres, that seeks to achieve consistent and useful disclosure by corporates and financial institutions on how climate risk impacts their businesses. This is becoming the focus of a number of regulatory consultations. New Zealand has already announced that it is consulting on making the TCFD mandatory. It is expected that the TCFD will become mandatory for listed issuers in the UK from 2022 onwards, and the European Union is also factoring the TCFD into its non-financial reporting standards. You can see around the TCFD references to a number of other regulatory instruments, including the EU's non-financial reporting directive, the responsible sourcing conflict minerals regulation, again from the EU, the Modern Slavery Act from the UK. We're also seeing the EU Sustainable Finance Package kicking in next March and giving rise to a host of obligations, which I will chat you through very shortly. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the references to a number of soft laws, which again have been mainstreaming in the context of project financings around the world, particularly the Equator Principles and the IFC performance standards. So lots of developments here, a lot to get your head round and plenty to keep us busy. So I mentioned the EU Sustainable Finance Package, and I think it is really worth focusing on that in this presentation so that you have an awareness of what I would say is probably the leading package of regulatory reforms in Europe that is causing the most change, the greatest shift, particularly in the asset management and fund sphere operating out of Europe at the moment. So you can see on the left-hand side that the EU reforms are aimed at regulated firms and corporates. We've also referred here to UK reforms, and I will come on to the impact of Brexit a little bit later on. The reforms are aimed at preventing a concept called greenwashing, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. It's the idea that you claim that your business is extremely green, you make lots and lots of very positive claims, but actually the reality is quite different. So that's the main aim. There's also, I would say, a positive goal, which is to encourage more money to flow into sustainable activities and better management of sustainability risks. On the right-hand side, we have noted that the reforms largely apply to UK and EU players, but in some cases, the reforms have got direct or indirect global reach, so also relevant to some funds that are based outside of the EU. So what is the package? It's got 3 core legislative proposals, which have now become legislative texts. So first of all, we have the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Regulation, and then the Sustainable Finance Benchmarks Regulation. So if we look at the disclosure regulation first, in a nutshell, this regulation places new disclosure obligations on asset managers and funds in the EU, which will mean that from next March, they will need to disclose on their website how they take sustainability risks into their investment decision-making process. Now, that is the headline disclosure obligation. There are lots of other disclosure obligations embedded in the text, which I won't go through for you today. But I think the main thing to bear in mind is that there is an expectation that sustainability risk management will become much more sophisticated in the asset management sector. And as a result, there will be enhanced disclosure and scrutiny of those disclosures by the market and by non-market actors and regulators. The bottom left-hand rectangle obviously refers to the Taxonomy Regulation. This is, I would say, a really key regulatory development. The greenwashing that I referred you to earlier is really the target of this regulation. They are seeking to get rid of the greenwashing by defining sustainable and sustainable concepts once and for all. It's a very, very long text with a variety of sections, and it goes into very, very prescriptive detail which economic activities can be defined as sustainable. And sustainability is defined not just by reference to environmental concepts, but also social concepts such as human rights compliance. And on the bottom right-hand rectangle, we refer to the Benchmarks Regulation, which effectively creates 2 new categories of sustainable benchmarks for the economy to use and rely on. So just a little bit more on the Taxonomy Regulation. What is a sustainable investment? On the right-hand side, you can see that the European Union has defined the sustainable objectives for environment, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, transition to a circular economy, good pollution prevention and control, and the protection of biodiversity and ecosystems. So if your economic activity is taxonomy eligible, you're going to have to reliably claim that it contributes substantially to at least one of these 6 environmental objectives. It does no significant harm to any of the other environmental objectives, and it's carried out in compliance with certain minimum social and governance safeguards. And those social and governance safeguards include a number of UN human rights and international human rights frameworks. You also have to comply with certain technical screening criteria, which, as I have said, are listed in great detail in the text. So beyond that, I mean, I said I'd talk a little bit about Brexit, which I think is really, really interesting. The UK Green Finance Strategy, which came out a couple of years back, committed the UK to matching the EU's green ambitions. And this is something that, you know, we've seen some press on in recent weeks. Boris Johnson obviously making announcements recently on the green agenda and its importance to the UK post-Brexit, post-proper Brexit. And this regulatory push continues apace within the UK. We have the Prudential Regulatory Authority in the UK and the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK pushing regulatory changes both for the banking sector and again for the funds sector, mandating more disclosure on ESG and climate risks. We've referenced a few other things on this slide, such as a task force, which we were involved in, and also the EU Commission's non-binding guidelines on climate-related reporting, which effectively referred to the TCFD voluntary standard that I referred to earlier, again, developing the references to climate risk in non-financial reports. So here's the TCFD. I think it really is beneficial for you to know what it is and what it consists of. So as I said, it's a voluntary disclosure standard, and in the guidance published by the TCFD, they refer to 4 key pillars for the purposes of disclosure. Those are disclosures on strategy, governance, risk management, and metrics and targets. And effectively, the expectation is that corporates and financial institutions will disclose how climate risks are taken into account in each of those pillars. It's been very popular, as you can see on this slide. I think those figures should probably be updated. This is from a little while back. But the main point is that the TCFD have given guidance on voluntary reports which have come out in recent years, and the feedback is that there needs to be more disclosure on the resilience of corporate strategies to climate risks. And we continue to watch this very, very closely. The EU Sustainable Finance Package, as I noted earlier, is creating different types of financial products, which we've listed in this slide. And I won't go into the technical detail, but I think it's just really important to know that we've got the emergence of financial products with a sustainable objective, financial products that promote environmental or social characteristics, and then the rest of the world. And this new disclosure regime is really promoting the greener products by requiring greater disclosure on all types of products. At the product level, we're seeing the development of new standards on green bonds, a connection between green bonds and the EU taxonomy, so that there is better understanding on the green profile of these bonds and the use of proceeds that corporates are pushing the financing towards. We're also seeing the emergence of new derivatives and structured products, sustainable securitizations, green structured notes, blue bonds, which are otherwise known as Save the Ocean bonds, and effectively lots of new instruments being designed to transfer ESG risks. And then on the banking side, green and sustainability-linked loans have also emerged in recent years, connecting lending to the key performance indicators that the borrowers set themselves, with greater attention also being paid to the soft law standards, such as the Equator Principles, which I mentioned earlier. And I'll pause there for questions.
So everyone, thank you so much, Ruth. I just wanted to remind you that you can put your hand up if you would like to ask a verbal question. Otherwise, if you're not comfortable with that for whatever reason, you can refer to the Q&A box at the bottom. where you can type out your question to Ruth. We'll pause a couple moments, and if we don't get any questions coming in, I know I definitely have one or two. So Miriam, we'll start with your question. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, I just have one question. First, I just want to thank you. That was really interesting. I was just wondering, with regard to the rise of ESG factors and the EU Sustainable Finance Package, like to what extent do you think this has actually been effective in reducing greenwashing and actually kind of like promoting firms to make real change?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Marianne. So I think the key point to note at this stage is that these regulatory obligations kick in next year. So we are yet to see the impact of these changes. It is, I would say, causing quite a bit of consternation in the sector at the moment, because it's pretty clear that greenwashing is still very much a possibility, even when you define sustainability so comprehensively. And there have been, there's been commentary by some academics that there needs to be perhaps a verification mechanism in terms of sustainability impacts. That has not come through yet. But I think in terms of the concrete impact of this framework, it remains to be seen what will happen.
Well, thank you very much. That was very insightful.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for organising this event, and Ruth for this really interesting presentation. I had a question because I've been studying mostly the new Stewardship Code 2020 this year in the UK. And I just had a question regarding this new piece of soft law, which demands asset managers and asset owners, in a nutshell, to increase disclosure relating to ESG matters, which is quite new in the UK. And I just wanted to ask Ruth your opinion on this piece of law, and to what extent do you believe that narrative reporting and disclosure will be an effective tool to push business towards more sustainable practices, and also push investors to engage in this, and to what extent is the market aligned with these objectives in terms of their underlying incentives?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question, Emma. So, I mean, in terms of my opinion of the Stewardship Code, you know, I wouldn't be able to comment on the specifics of that reform, but I can tell you that, you know, the impact of changes to disclosure regimes is quite significant. And the reason for that is because it requires the organisations that face the new disclosure obligations to really knuckle down and think about what their impacts actually are, because they are, to the extent that these disclosure obligations are mandatory, they're obviously telling the world in the form of regulators and NGOs and other government actors exactly what their risk profile is in relation to the topic in question. Now, one great example of a mandatory disclosure regime which has caused a great deal of activity and examination is the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. And I know from having advised a number of clients on that regime that it caused, I would say, a real shift in terms of the focus on diligencing that topic, so that these new disclosures could be crafted and put out to the market. You asked about the investor agenda and how aligned that is with this shift. Again, a really great element to your question. So we are definitely seeing investors, institutional investors, with a really, really pronounced focus on ESG. Examples include BlackRock, State Street, and there are obviously many others. And these institutional investors have been in the background for a number of years now, developing their own frameworks to assess ESG risks and to really get the full picture on the profile of the corporates that they lend to, that they finance. And I think with the advent of these new disclosure regimes and the definition of sustainability, we're seeing that the investors are actually having to shift their scrutiny, their frameworks, so that they match the regulatory requirements, and that is quite interesting in itself. So you could have been a very, I would say, very focused institutional investor up to this point, and these regulatory changes mean that you ought to re-examine what you've done up to this point and think, how can I improve that so that I meet these new regulatory expectations? So lots of activity happening at the moment in the investor space.
Thank you, Ruth. That's really helpful.
No problem.
Hi, Ruth. Can you hear me?
I can, Daniel.
Hi. Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. It was really, really useful. I used to work in business intelligence in kind of modern slavery and human rights and supply chain. So it was really interesting to hear the developments on that. So I kind of have two questions, and the first is related to that. So when I used to work in that field, one of the really big things, and this was kind of in 2017, so just after TCFDs had come out, 2 years, and the first year where Modern Slavery Act was really coming into fruition. And one of the things that a lot of our clients were saying was that the issue wasn't so much that the board wasn't on board with kind of like reporting, it was the engagement of the rest of the management structure, so middle management, really trying to understand how they can integrate it. Have you seen any more developments perhaps on kind of whole company structure in getting on board with like kind of this kind of social ESG governance and due diligence? So that's the first question. And the second question is that the kind of rise of ESG is as a kind of a benefit to the awareness of these kind of issues that have come into play. And you've talked about the rise of privacy and things like GDPR and digital human rights. Do you think there's a place, or perhaps it's not in law and legislation, but do you think there's a way for kind of a horizon scanning, so things like artificial intelligence ethics, to be implemented into this ESG structure easily? Or is it something that will require kind of very long-term legislation, because there will be increasingly more issues as we find them out? So those are just kind of two questions I had.
Yeah, fantastic. So, I mean, I think, yeah, in terms of your first question, maybe if I take your second question first. So if we look at the sort of the future gazing, and you've talked about AI very insightfully, you're absolutely right. The rise of artificial intelligence, and I would say the automation of a number of the roles that we have in society is a huge ESG challenge. And privacy is obviously really in focus at the moment, and there's a lot of really fascinating debates going on about what that will mean, or what that should mean for us as private citizens. I think, to be honest with you, at the moment, the regulators have a huge amount to focus on, particularly in relation to climate risk. And so, what I'm seeing is a focus on ESG in general, but a real overarching concern about climate change in particular. And so a lot of energy in the ESG sphere is going into the regulation of that particular risk at the moment. Now, then moving beyond that, obviously, real focus on human rights, real focus on the social agenda. there has not yet been a concrete regulatory agenda put forward in relation to the concepts that you have mentioned. And I think really, Daniel, the reason for that is because there is just so much to do already on the ESG objectives and challenges that we're facing at the moment. Your first question on cascading the focus of ESG throughout the organization, a really, really great question. I think it's fairly safe to say that, yeah, in the work that I've been doing, that there have certainly been clients that have faced challenges spreading the word and seeking, I would say, greater engagement on the topic and the impact of these regulatory changes in particular on the whole organization. And certainly in many instances, that's why Linklaters is brought in, because we have the expertise to explain to the wider organization why these things are important and what the concrete impacts are going to be. Now, as always with huge organizational shifts, these things take time. It takes a lot of energy. There's lots of stakeholder engagement that needs to be done. It's a labor of love, and actually, you know, we really do just have to take it one step at a time. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, boards are very much engaged, I would say, across most of the organizations that are, I would say, at the sharp end of these changes in particular. And it is something I think that is just going to be really fascinating to watch as we move through the next 10 years, what choices are made in corporate strategy and how organizations adapt.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I completely agree. Labor of love. Definitely on the slavery debates, that's definitely the case.
Okay, thank you to everyone that put their hand up, and thank you, Ruth, for answering those questions so incredibly. We have a couple typed out questions here that I'll read out, and make sure if you have any questions, you get them in, because we're going to have to wrap up shortly. We have a question from one of our speaker partners, Gabriella, and she's asking Ruth if there are any regulations that you would remove.
This is such a challenging question, Gabriella. Thank you so much for this question.
Putting you on the spot.
So yeah, I'm just looking at my Jackson Pollock slide actually, and that is, yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, I think there's certainly proposals that are on the table that I think are going to cause quite a bit of concern. And the reason I say that is there are some regulatory changes which are going to create major litigation risks for corporates and financial institutions. And one of these sets of regulatory reforms is linked to the Sustainable Finance Package. It covers product manufacturing. And product manufacturing means financial product manufacturing, and it can cover things like shares and bonds in particular. Now, one of the, I would say, unintended consequences of these changes could be, and obviously they're still being thrashed out at the moment, but one of the unintended consequences could be that issuers of bonds and sponsors of financings could face increased liability when it comes to the ESG related statements that are made in the context of public offerings and bond offerings. Now, this is going to be quite a change if this does come through, and certainly, you know, there's a lot of concern at the moment because the capital markets have operated up to this point in time without this level of litigation risk, and certainly, you know, there are various ways that could be deployed around that. You could obviously outsource the risk to specialists who would be able to verify the ESG statements and to be held accountable for the lack of accuracy of those ESG statements. However, you know, it's not totally clear if something like that would be useful, given things like limitation of liability, etc., etc. So I think, you know, and it's really a general statement. I've referred to one specific area, but a general statement that I would make about the regulatory reforms is ambition is great and we need to be ambitious. It's very clear that we need to. But on the flip side, increasing the litigation risk of corporates and financial institutions is not going to get us to a low carbon economy more effectively. It's not going to get us there more quickly. And I think we need to think very critically about the risks that we're creating for corporates and financial institutions in this context.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we have a couple more questions coming in. We have a little blue hand up, so we'll start with that question. Ian, Kit, and then we can, if we still have time, we can go to the other ones in the chat.
Hi, Ruth. How are you?
I'm good, Kit. How are you?
Good, thank you. So I just had a quick question on the capital markets side of things, and you know, you discussed BlackRock and how they've put quite an emphasis on ESG, and they've created some exchange traded funds and other securities that could be purchased on these on the S&P and things like that. How does a company like BlackRock protect themselves from legal liability, like you were just discussing, when you know they're not necessarily directly responsible for the promises that are being made by the companies that are included in their funds? And so I was just curious as to how they were supporting those initiatives from the institutional capital side or the funding side.
That's a really great question. I mean, so I will say up front that I'm not a capital markets lawyer. And so, you know, many of my colleagues would be better placed to answer that question than me, but I can talk about my general experience of capital markets transactions and, you know, the processes that underpin the diligence of those offerings. I mean, typically on the sponsor side, you know, you would see a fairly detailed diligence package being pulled together, which seeks to verify that the statements that are being made are actually accurate. And obviously, having not been involved in the BlackRock exchange traded funds in particular, I can't talk to exactly what they did, but I would imagine that there was a very focused process around making sure that what was represented was actually accurate. And in some instances, you can bring in subject matter experts to verify that what is being said is actually accurate. And certainly I'm working at the moment on a transaction involving capital raising, which involves technical environmental experts, actually, who have got very, very detailed understanding of the underlying activities that are forming the subject of investment. And they are able to provide assurance that the processes that are being followed are actually being followed and being followed effectively.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time. There's just two more questions, so we can try to get to both of them. But we have one typed out from Farine, and she's asking, Ruth, if you can elaborate a little bit about your journey, particularly as a woman navigating this field and working in corporate law. What advice do you have for young women entering law and other male-dominated industries? And then she adds on, has your passion for sustainability ever been chalked up to your gender? Often she finds women are characterized as more sensitive to these areas.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love this question. Yeah, can I just go with the chalking? Yeah, absolutely, definitely. It has. I'm afraid that's just an understanding which is shared by some people in the sphere that, you know, ESG is more popular with women. And actually in practice, I find that there are more female professionals in the sphere than male. So in many ways, there's some accuracy to that statement, but my hope is that that will change. And I guess looking at the first part of your question, Corinne, okay, so my journey navigating this field, the legal field, and working in corporate law as a woman, it's been really interesting. I mean, I think, you know, it's certainly the case that as a sector, I'm not talking about Linklaters, which I think is actually a really great environment for women, but as a sector, there are lots of challenges that women face. And I think, you know, the advice that I would give a young woman entering law or any other male-dominated industry today is to just really focus on the confidence that you have in yourself as a professional, as an individual. Don't worry too much about gender and gender differences. Don't focus on that. Just really come back to yourself and your skill set and what you bring to the table. And I guess, you know, perhaps some gender specific advice. There's obviously loads of advice that people can give on this area, but I guess some top tips would be, you know, speak up in meetings. If you don't feel confident enough to, just, you know, force yourself to, just make sure that your voice is heard, that your opinion is heard. Listen to others who've navigated the field before you, ask for their advice, as you're clearly doing. And, you know, put your hand up. Put your hand up for projects. I think that, you know, we tend to feel that we aren't able to do more, when actually, if we take on more going through our career, we develop much more quickly. And I think that is that's something that, you know, we tend to need to be told, is take on more projects and develop yourself so that you can develop your confidence and grow as a professional. And obviously that feedback applies to men as well. But certainly in the women's leadership training that I've had, I've received that advice, and it's been really, really great advice for me.
Thank you for that, Ruth. I completely agree. We have one last question before we thank you formally. So we have a question typed out here from Nadia, who is on our executive team. And she says, hi, Ruth, you mentioned that you entered Linklaters with a clear interest in environmental law, but also gained exposure to corporate finance seats in the beginning. Have you stumbled upon challenges where you have found it difficult to reconcile the work you do in corporate seats with ESG issues and considerations?
Yeah, fantastic question. Have I stumbled upon challenges? So I guess the challenges that I had coming through were that ESG was not necessarily in focus at the time. And I mean, it puzzled me, but then I also knew that the time wasn't quite right. In the past 18 months to 2 years, it's been very clear that ESG factors have really come to the fore for a variety of reasons, some of which we've touched on in this presentation. But in many ways, you know, I did focus on the fact that I was doing great work at a great firm. There were changes afoot, and there was an opportunity to work on those ESG challenges already at Linklaters, because Linklaters has prioritized the ESG practice when many of its competitors had really cut back their ESG offering in the wake of the 2008 recession. And so I never felt like ESG was off the agenda within the firm, not at all. There's definitely been, I would say, challenging scenarios that I've advised on in the context of my work. But again, you know, the great thing about being an ESG lawyer is that you get to tell the client what the regulatory position is and what they can and can't do. You almost take on that teaching role, and you know, that has been, I would say, really satisfying in the course of my career.
Wow, brilliant. Thank you so much, Ruth, for all of your insights and answering all of the questions. And thank you to our delegates for coming up with such thoughtful, well thought out questions. It's a true pleasure to hear from you, Ruth, and I'm going to allow Gabriella to close us up here.
Super.
Hi, thank you, Ruth, for such an insightful talk. It was really good to hear not only about the difficulties that are facing companies when they try and become more socially responsible, but also it was good to hear about your personal journey, particularly as someone who has aspirations to go into a career in law. It's been really interesting to see the good things and the positive impacts you can have through a career in law. Often we hear more about the more corporate side, and it was nice to get another point of view from that and the positive impacts that you've had. And yeah, so it's been great to have you as a partner this year, and I really appreciate, so does the whole team, you sharing your expertise and your time both today and throughout the year. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.